So, we're doing book 7 today. And let's see. That one is concerned with these different states of character that you notice I put on the board. And you notice I've got them in sort of a kind of schema where self-control and lack of self-control are really close to each other, and virtue and vice are further away from each other, and superhuman virtue and brutality or sickness are even further apart from each other. That's because this is supposed to represent how these states actually are in relation to each other. Superhuman virtue, actually I'll leave that up there. Superhuman virtue, within a religious sense, would be something like saintliness. Aristotle actually talks about people being almost divine. So, the heroes for the ancient Greeks exhibited a kind of superhuman virtue, something going beyond the normal realm of virtue that the good people that you could point to had, sort of like the prime exemplars of what it means to be a courageous person or a generous person or a honest person or any other virtue that you want to think of. We're not actually going to talk much about superhuman virtue today. Aristotle doesn't talk much about it, so we're not going to. What we're going to focus on is mostly this stuff. So I want to hit on each one of these very quickly. Brutality or sickness. Aristotle talks about cases in which a person is not really morally responsible for not just their actions, but the kind of person that they are, the kind of state that they're in. So we could think of cases like, really hardcore addictions, where we actually hold somebody who's, say, addicted to crack, cocaine, or crystal meth, or heroin. Do we hold them responsible to the same degree, bless you, as we do other people who aren't addicted to things? Some of us do. But maybe according to Aristotle, maybe that's a mistake. Maybe there's a certain set of thresholds that after you pass, you're really not responsible for your actions. And one of the things that Aristotle says about this that I think is really interesting, he says, in a certain way, it's less bad than vice. But in a certain sense, it's also more horrific. Because something has been damaged, something has been lost that was distinctively human. And the reason why I use this term brutality is because the Greek word that Aristotle is using actually means something like animal likeness, being reduced to your animal nature. The addict is still functioning as a human being in certain respects, but not functioning as a human being in the higher respects and the things that make us most fully human. They're within the grips of something else. And, other things may be working, right? Their intellect may be working in certain respects. They're trying to figure out, what can I do to get this fixed? But certain key things have been shut off or burnt out. And maybe permanently, Some drugs can actually literally destroy parts of your brain. Hardcore alcoholics who are close to the end, they almost can't do anything, can they? I don't know if any of you have ever seen them. And you don't rely on them to be the sort of moral agents that you do a normal human being, even a vicious human being, somebody who has a bad character trait that's been established within them through their own choices, where they actually get things wrong. They're mistaken about what's right and wrong because they've done the wrong thing so many times. Some other cases that would be like this, think about when people have been subjected to horrific abuse. Are they responsible for their actions in the same way? Are they responsible for their character in the same way that the rest of us are? Aristotle, again, would say no. He actually brings up the example of sexual abuse of children. If you look carefully, if you read between the lines in this book. Practice that existed among some of the people that the Greeks called barbarians, actually among some of the Greeks. That's okay. People in a case like that, if they've been subjected to horrific abuse, very often they've not been able to develop as human beings in the moral sense. And so, like the vicious person, they may actually see what they're doing as good, but the vicious person could be different. Somebody who's over here can't really be different. Other things that you could think of, what if there's brain damage? Or what if some disease actually screws up parts of the brain? Or what if there's what we call a chemical imbalance in the brain? Think of some of the things that we prescribe medication for that people respond to, some mental illnesses. What are some of the things people take pharmaceuticals for? You can think of that.
ADD.
And I think Ritalin is still like one of the drugs of choice for that, right?
Yeah. Like Adderall. Concerta.
Adderall, yeah. What is it?
Concerta.
Okay. Yeah, a lot of people, ADD is highly overdiagnosed, but the fact that it's overdiagnosed doesn't mean that it's all just in people's heads. That means that people are sloppy with their diagnoses. So that means some people actually do have it. Some people actually do respond to Ritalin. Actually, almost everybody responds to Ritalin. There's housewives who take it so they can get through craft projects. There's students who don't have ADD who take it so they can study cram for exams. There's all sorts of abuse out there, so Ritalin seems to be particularly effective. But think of other things too. There's all sorts of antidepressants out there. Why are people given those? Because they're depressed, because they actually feel down. Sometimes they're unable to function. Aristotle doesn't actually talk about sadness in terms of virtue and vice, interestingly enough. But he could. Do some people get more sad than they want to without having good reason to? Yeah. Some people like to, bask and wallow in misery. Some of those people may not actually have a pathological state. Some of those people just may have, they may be what we call malingerers, right? Or they may be down all the time because they choose to be down all the time because they get something out of it. That would be a vice. But if there's really something wrong with the person, organically, psychologically, then Aristotle would say they're not actually responsible. And they may be so damaged that they can't be fixed, too. So, what we're going to look at today is much more of the stuff that's in here. So, virtue and vice, we've already talked a lot about. I don't think we need to talk that much more about that. So what I want to talk about in particular is two things. Self-control and lack of self-control. We're going to look at that in a bit more detail. And the other thing that I want to hit on is how do we change as human beings? You notice that I drew this kind of arrow here. So let's start with that. We have this arrow here, and what is that representing? A path of moral transformation towards the good, moral progress. Remember at the beginning of the semester, we read that McIntyre piece, and last week we talked about narratives of moral progress or moral decline. We could also draw another arrow going in the other direction. With superhuman virtue, we're just going to leave that out of the picture for right now, because Aristotle doesn't tell us that much about it other than it's a really great thing. With brutality or sickness, it's much harder to change that sort of thing. But these are the things that are within our power. So, think for example, how do people actually get better? Let's say we take somebody who's got a vicious disposition. Some of you may have been in this case. Let's say you have a vicious disposition with respect to anger, or with respect to your spending habits, or with respect to whether you stood up for yourself and what's right in relation to friends. What Aristotle calls obsequiousness or flattery, which is an inability to actually say no to people. Or maybe you were, kind of a jerk, at the other end of who's got this virtue of friendliness And, you know, being unwilling to give people pain by saying no to them, that's a vice. Being at the other end of saying no to everybody and you know, always wanting to just do your own thing, and whether it causes other people pain or not, that would also be a vice. So let's say you have a vicious character with respect to one of these sort of things. Now, the person who's vicious, one of the things that keeps them there is not just the force of habit, but when we've talked about this a number of times over the semester, they actually come to think that that's the right thing to do. So what Aristotle calls their moral principle has gotten screwed up. It's become corrupted, it's become damaged. And that's the best part of themselves. So the vicious person is actually, at least in one way, screwed up part of themselves. Could be partly their fault, could be partly somebody else's, like, you know, if your mom and dad were vicious, you're at much greater risk for being vicious yourself because they're your models, right? And maybe they have you do vicious things. Like the dad who makes his son or daughter fight with other people all the time. Stand up for yourself. And maybe that kid is going to have anger problems or be foolhardy when it comes to courage. But at a certain point, usually when you're an adult, if you have a vice, you can at least, there's still a door open to saying, somebody coming to you and saying, hey, you're acting like a jerk. I don't like this. You shouldn't behave like this. And then, you know, they say, well, this is the way I should behave. This is the right thing, you know, because their moral principle's been screwed up. And then somebody else still confronts them. They say, you know what? It's not the right thing. Everybody doesn't act like that. Look at that guy over there. He doesn't behave like that. And then it could actually like hit home. And you could say, oh, wow, I am screwed up. There is something wrong with me. Now, can you just snap your fingers and I'm going to quit being like this? Is that how it works? Think about anger, for example. I don't know if any of you have anger problems, but you know, if you actually come to the point where you no longer say, yeah, it's just fine for me to be as angry as I want, whenever I want, with whoever I want, and to do whatever I want in revenge, you know, in retaliation or revenge to them. After you get past that, which is, you know, again, having that moral principle screwed up, that's what makes it vice, and you start saying, wow, I'm really hurting people and alienating people, and I don't really like how this feels, and it's making me a worse person, and I used to have some control over this, but now I feel like I have no control over this. After you have that moment of clarity, that's just the beginning of the work, isn't it? Because what happens the next time you get into a situation where someone makes you angry? Can you just say, now I remember having this moment, and I realized this was a bad thing for me to do. Does that work? No? I mean, if it does, then you don't really have a vice of anger. If you have a vice, it's because you have a certain habit built up. And you have certain patterns. And it's really easy to fall back into those tendencies. So when somebody criticizes you, and you start feeling angry, is that going to immediately go away when you say, oh, I resolved not to be angry anymore. I'm not going to be an angry person. It doesn't work that way. You have to actually practice. You have to undo the old habit and eventually try to replace it with another habit. That's this progress. Because what happens first? Do you feel, you know, the virtuous person actually feels good in doing the right things. If you're standing up against your anger, if you're going against what you would like to do, you would like to swear at somebody, or talk about them behind their back, or make a passive-aggressive excuse, bless you, or pop them in the nose. And you're doing that because you like doing that sort of thing. Are you gonna like not doing that? You're gonna find that painful, aren't you? Your desires are being frustrated. You're actually gonna have to proceed through this cusp here between lack of self-control and self-control. And what's going to happen at first is you're actually going to have to, first of all, recognize this is not the way I ought to be. Not just this is not productive for me, or this is turning people off, but you actually have to have a moment of moral recognition where you say, this is not good. I want to be better than And then you're over here, perhaps, starting to move away from this. You know, these are not, you know, sort of like train stops where you're either at this station or this station or this station or this station. These kind of fade into each other. Aristotle's not saying that there's easy lines to draw between these. You get over here, and now you have bad desires. And you recognize them as bad desires. The question is, that's why I put this X here, it's sort of like the decision point. Do you give in to those bad desires, or do you fight against those bad desires? Or do you make yourself do the right thing? Now that you can actually at least have some clarity about what the right thing is, you're not totally deluded in thinking that the wrong thing is the right thing. You make yourself do the right thing even though you want to do the wrong thing. Your desires are pulling you in the wrong way. If you do more often than not, then you have self-control. If you don't, if you actually recognize what the right thing is, but you allow your desires to just pull you whatever way you're going, you're better off than the person who thinks that they're doing the right thing by acting like a jerk. But you're still not as good off as the person who's resisting their desires, who's choosing to do the right thing, because who's actually going to make progress?
Versus the self-control.
Yeah, it's not enough just to have like intentions. Well, we all have all sorts of intentions, you know. If my intentions were reality, I'd know like 10 languages by now, you know. And I managed to learn, well, I had an advantage with French because my family spoke some French, but you know, I just study as well. French and German, Latin and ancient Greek. I had all sorts of intentions. I intended to learn Italian, and actually got some teach yourself Italian books, and did a few lessons in them, but I don't know Italian. Simply desiring it doesn't make it so. You know, I have free weights at home that haven't been picked up more than like, you know, once every so often for a couple of years. They're actually holding a door in place. You know, I guess they're doing some work.
Like what?
Does that put me back in shape? No, you actually have to do things. And it's the same way when it comes to moral actions. You actually, if you want to be courageous, you actually have to exercise courage. You actually have to do the sort of things that a courageous person would do. If you want to be temperate, you actually have to do the sort of things that a temperate person would do in the situations that call for them. If you want to get control over your anger, you actually have to stop your anger at some point and, you know, refrain from retaliating and try to forgive people, as tough as it is, when you don't want to. To do that is to be self-controlled. Yeah.
Now, what if like injustice is happening and you're just a bystander and like you're angry that it's happening?
Yeah.
For instance, yesterday I was at the line at the cafeteria and it was quesadillas, and there's only a limited amount of like a hot commodity in the cafeteria.
Yeah.
Somebody cut in front of me. Well, cut in front of not just me, but 2 other people in front of me.
Yeah.
And I kind of just went, come on, man, there's a line. And he just looked at me and went, seriously, and then walked away.
Should take it off his plate.
But I mean, does that fall under like being angry and lack of self-control, or does that fall under something else?
Well, I mean, it's interesting because Aristotle would he actually has a different classification for that emotion. He calls that righteous indignation. When you see somebody who gets away with something that they ought not get away with. I suppose insofar as it affects you, it's anger, and then insofar as it's, you know, affecting these other bystanders who, you know, you're not like friends with or anything, then it's righteous indignation. And the question would be what you do with the emotional response. Because remember, with anger, it's not just whether you feel anger, it's whether you feel it at the right time, for the right reason, to the right extent, and how you act on it. Imagine that you actually like went up to the guy and you punched him. You know? Well, that would be a problem. That would clearly be excessive reaction. Saying something to him doesn't strike me as doing anything wrong, and actually, given that most people often just sort of suck it up. Maybe that actually exhibits courage. The difference between the self-controlled person and the virtuous person is the self-controlled person still has some desires that they can recognize as bad in the sense of for the wrong things or being excessive. The virtuous person actually has good desires. That's part of what habit will do for you. If you do the right thing by forcing yourself to do the right thing in the situations that call for it, it takes a certain sort of discipline. Then eventually that will stick. That will become part of your character. It will permeate who you are, and it will change you over time. So think for example of courage with respect to public speaking. Right? Some of you are still, I think, a little bit afraid in situations of public speaking, and you don't like to do it. But some of you have overcome that fear by doing it, right? Some of you didn't worry about it to begin with, but that's pretty rare. That becomes part of who you are. Your desires can be changed. They're not just something that are imposed on you by the objects out there. They're something you have some degree of control over. If you find that you have an excessive desire for watching television too much, right? This is a trivial example, but it would be a matter of temperance. Let's say, because we like watching TV, right? Let's say you find yourself watching 6 hours of TV every single day, and you find yourself when you go do other things, like you go to the amusement park or you go out with friends or something like that, you're thinking about, I wonder what's on. I kind of miss being home, sitting in front of the TV, watching it, right? You may have a vicious disposition. I mean, if you actually tell yourself, yeah, this is normal behavior, this is good for me, I should be watching TV as much as I can, then you've got a vice. If you actually, feel guilty about it a bit, you say, man, I watch too much TV. This isn't good for me. But you still keep doing it. Then you're lacking self-control. If you actually rein it in and you cut back your TV watching to, say, 2 hours a day, there's still, quite a bit, but, for every day. But it would be an improvement, wouldn't it? From 6 hours? So you rein it in and you say, I'm only going to watch 2 hours a day, and then, it gets to that 2 hour point, and then, the commercials come on for what's coming up next. You're like, hey, I'd like to watch another Law and Order, or whatever it is. I mean, you could actually watch Law and Order 24 hours a day, because there's so many episodes. They actually had a proposal to put together a Law and Order channel at one point.
People would actually watch it.
Oh yeah.
I think my dad just quit his job.
I can watch that forever.
Well, there's so many episodes now that by the time that you go through them, you can actually forget how the episode happened. So you see it again and you're like, I want to see how this pans out. But, so you impose that discipline on yourself. You feel a kind of pain at not getting to see the show that you want to see. It takes discipline in part because you don't feel like doing it, right? But if you keep doing it, eventually you will acquire that virtue of temperance, and you will want to do things that way. Now things will actually make more sense too. Think about this in terms of other virtues and vices. Think about just another one of temperance: eating. If you eat too much all the time when you're not supposed to, and you tell yourself that's the right thing to do, and you actually feel like that's the right thing to do, you've probably got a vicious disposition. Then you could also be, in lack of self-control. You know that you shouldn't have that third helping. Seconds might be okay in some cases, probably not in a lot of cases though. But let's say it gets to the third helping. Now it's pretty clear, right? You shouldn't have that third helping, but you still do. Well, then you don't have self-control yet. Let's say you actually exercise self-control. You don't like it, right? What's it like to actually go on a diet? I'm sure some of you have done that. Is dieting fun?
No.
It's terrible, It makes you irritable with other people, and why does it do that? Because your desires are being checked. And the only thing that's keeping, think about, it'd be different if there wasn't any food out there, right? It'd be easy to to be restrained with food if there was only a little bit. But I mean, you could just walk across the street and eat so many different things, couldn't you? Or the cafeteria. Is there anybody following you around saying, now, you've had enough. I think you should leave. You can eat all you want, can't you? Right? Well, the self-control will, if you're self-controlled, you'll actually not like what you're doing at first, but you'll do it. Because you recognize it's the right thing to do. You'll choose the right thing. And then after a while, the smaller portion actually becomes, the right amount of food becomes what you want. And it may be hard, it's very hard quite often with a lot of these things, when you're at this point, to ever imagine a point where you're going to want the right thing. But eventually it does come. This is one of the interesting things about virtue ethics. Until you actually develop some of the virtues, virtue ethics doesn't make as much sense. Right? And to the vicious person, it doesn't make any sense altogether. Those virtuous people, they're crazy. But it's really the vicious person who's in a sense crazy. Now, if you can make more progress, can you also decline? What do you think? Let's say you have a virtue. Could you lose that virtue?
Mm-hmm.
How would you lose a virtue that you've acquired? Yeah.
Okay.
And then
Sure. But like we talked when we were doing Plato in regards to like having rationale and then the passionate side of a person giving in to your desires. Just because you're virtuous, I don't think the desire necessarily goes away. So if ration stops working,
Yeah.
rationale against that desire, then yeah, you start going towards a vice again.
okay, so if something happens within the person, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say the influence of more vicious people or any
Yes.
factor that could.
I think that's really important. Somebody comes along and you've got virtue established in your character, but you're surrounded with other people that are vicious or just even not self-controlled, and they're constantly throwing temptations in your face, and they're telling you things like you're really depriving yourself of a lot of fun. Why do you have to be such a stick in the mud? Or things like that. And then you start saying, well, maybe I'll give in on this one time. And then you do it that one time and nothing bad happens. Because, virtue doesn't disappear right away. And you're like, yeah, I'm still pretty good. And then you say, oh, okay, I'll do it the next time, and the next time. And after a while, oftentimes unconsciously, without us perceiving it, you start to slide. And now suddenly you find yourself no longer being attracted to the good. You find yourself having desires that you recognize as bad. And you still have some self-control. And you're able to say, I shouldn't do this. You could bounce yourself right back, couldn't you? Say, I gotta get myself back right with whatever this is. Or you could continue to decline. And if you go from self-control to a lack of self-control, then you've got problems. And if you don't have self-control, when it comes to these tempting situations, you will start to slide towards vice. Because at first you do things, and you know they're the wrong thing to do. And you say, well, I was overcome by my appetites, my desires. Or anger got away with me. Or, it seemed really nice at the time. I knew it wasn't the right thing to do. I kind of regret it, feel bad about it. After a while, you'll quit feeling bad, won't you? I mean, go, I'm not going to say try this out, but imagine trying this out. Go and steal some things, right? The first time you steal something, you probably feel bad about it. And then, do it a couple more times, some more times. And eventually it comes to seem normal to you, And you start thinking in terms of challenges. Can I steal this? Can I steal that? This would be a good thing to steal. And then after a while, now everything's out there for you to steal. And your desires, you know, are running the show. And a sort of corrupt moral principle. I knew guys, when I was in high school, it was kind of a thing for us to steal small things. You know? And I remember too when I was a kid, I had these older kids, right? They get you in trouble. And they want to do a shop with candy, right? And I remember going to the local gas station, and we had like this whole elaborate plan of like one kid's going to go up and buy some candy and get a bag, and then come back, and the rest of us put more candy in it, and you know, one kid would block the view and all that. And I felt like, you know, the world. I felt like the earth was going to open up and swallow me up. Exactly that. And I did it, and we got out of there, you know. And you know, I don't think the store owner even cared, but I could like feel his gaze upon me, you know. That started to go away after a while. And then, you know, I knew kids in high school who specialized in things like stealing Cadillac hood ornaments. You know, just walk around. One kid actually went to a Cadillac dealer and just went down the row of cars, you know, because they'd use them to make keychains at the time. Silly stuff. I knew other guys who were stealing big stuff, you know, who would break into things. Some were specializing in radar detectors at the time and stereos, and some of them were actually my friends. They had a business they called Midnight Sales and Services. And, you know, the longer you hang around with people like that, the more you're going to start to become vicious, the more your sense of right and wrong is going to get skewed. And the more that will eventually become part of your character, very difficult to eradicate. You're not doing well if you have a lack of self-control, but you're still better off than the vicious person. But if you keep doing that, there is a slide this way. Aristotle also does say that with certain vices, if they're practiced to, you know, if they go to, bless you, a really great extent, they could turn into this sort of thing, this brutalization or a kind of sickness. Yeah?
I understand that in some cases it can be like a really long process for the full cycle.
Yeah.
But is there any chance that, and I know that in times it can turn around and back, but
Yeah.
is there any chance that it can get stuck at some point in the fraction and people can be okay with that?
That a person could get stuck.
In between self-control and lack of self-control.
But Aristotle thinks actually that, in general, most of us are over here. You know, think about the way virtues and vices actually work. Most people are not actually vicious. Certainly not having all the vices, right? But they do actions that are the actions of vicious people. But when they do them, they may actually say, this isn't the right thing to do, but I'm going to do it anyway. Likewise, most people aren't actually virtuous, Aristotle thinks, because you got to like what you're doing. And a lot of us do good things, but just because we exercise self-control. And I think one of the keys for this too would be, do you exercise self-control even when some authority figure isn't making you do so? That would be how to tell if you actually do have self-control, because otherwise you're probably just doing it to evade punishment or gain reward. But yeah, you could oscillate between the two of these for a while, or you could sort of oscillate back and forth here. I mean, there are people who recognize their way of life as vicious, and then they start to make progress, and then it seems like they fall back. And there's people who are here, and they never seem to quite make it to virtue. And they recognize virtue is a good thing, but they're never able to like get themselves to like doing the right thing. But they're able to make themselves do the right thing at least, which is better than giving in. It's a good question. Again, remember, these are sort of gradations, rather than just simple stopping points. Well, let's look now at lack of self-control, specifically. Because Aristotle says a lot about this. He says that we could have a lack of self-control, and sometimes it's translated as weakness of will. That's another way to think of it. Incontinence is another term, although I try to avoid that because it has all sorts of, connotations with diapers and things along those lines, doesn't it, in our society. Aristotle distinguishes between different kinds, and he says that we can think of it in terms of the kinds of pleasures or pains that we have a hard time resisting, that get us to not follow principle, to not make the right choice. So what's incontinence or lack of self-control or akrasia per se? He says it has to do with bodily pleasures. And this makes sense. What are the things that we're most likely to go wrong with? Food, drink, our sexual desire, which is, by the way, we're living in a society, you guys all know this, which exploits our sexual desire in myriad different ways, right? Just down to the design of clothing, selling of products, the way things are set up. This is a very tough society to live in, I think, when it comes to that. It's a very tough society to have a virtuous disposition because there's so much pushing us in the other direction. And there's so much encouragement, actually, to not have self-control. Let your desires free. Think of half the advertisements that are out there. What happens with those? Well, the person pursues these desires where they avoid the pains that they experience when they don't get what they want, and they don't follow what reason or principle would tell them. So, what's a sort of classic example of that? Again, think about eating, right? Why are we so tempted to eat things that are bad for us? Yeah, there you go. What makes food actually taste good? The two biggest things that are not particularly good for us. Fat, yeah. And,
Grease.
well, grease is fat, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's fat. Fat actually is necessary for our diet to some extent, and it makes things taste good. It has a texture, it has a function. What else?
Are you thinking of salt, maybe?
Salt is another one. Sugar, sweetness. Yeah, we have too much salt in most of our food as well, and that enhances flavor. But sweetness, they add sugar to all sorts of things. And if it's not sugar, it's high fructose corn syrup. Spaghetti sauce. Does spaghetti sauce actually need sugar in it? They add it to it because we like it. I'm willing to bet that plenty of us, if somebody offered us a spoonful of sugar or honey or something like that, we probably would actually be willing to, I'll eat it. Now, we wouldn't do that with a spoonful of salt, unless you really, really like salt, or, like a glob of fat, unless you're, in really bad shape. So yeah, the food that we like is usually not that good for us. The richer the food, the less good it is for us. But it tastes great. Someday you guys should read Anthony Bourdain's Kitchen Confidential, where he sort of pulls the veil back on the sort of things that go on in restaurants. There might be a whole stick of butter in that meal that you're eating, because butter makes things taste good, right? So we have these desires, and lack of self-control with respect to food, what does that look like? Now again, remember, lack of self-control, you know what the right thing to do is, but you find yourself not doing it because of desires. What sort of things happen? What are examples of that? Do any of you get up for a midnight snack sometimes? Is it good to eat at midnight? Why not? Yeah.
I think it happens every night with college students when they go out and they just go and get food just because at the end of the night.
Well, if you've been drinking, you probably want to eat something because alcohol, tends to bring that up. Plus, it might be a way to socialize too. But yeah, midnight snacks. Maybe once in a while is okay, but probably not every night. Or even 5 nights a week. What about portion size? How are we with portion size? Well, yeah, I mean, have any of you guys ever looked at this, or like portion size over time? You know, the size that a McDonald's fries used to be compared to what it is now? Amazing, isn't it? Yeah, there is, once you actually look at it, it does get disgusting, but that doesn't necessarily keep us from eating it, does it? You know? It helps if you're right, it does help emotionally if you can make it look unappealing. Right? What are you going to say?
Did McDonald's have like an extra large fry?
Super,
Yeah.
super size, yeah.
But even just the regular fry is bigger than it used to be. Yeah.
Well, I was watching the show, I forgot what it was called, but they were showing McDonald's in France versus McDonald's in the States.
Yes.
That even like the McChickens are smaller, like in France, and like the soda cups and whatnot are smaller
Yeah,
as
portion
well.
size is smaller.
I mean, if you think about it, if you get a large soda at McDonald's, you're kind of like drinking like a bottle of soda.
Like a 2-liter bottle.
Pretty much.
Well,
I mean,
maybe not the whole.
not discounting the ice, yeah, but it's
Yeah.
crazy, yeah. But it
Yeah.
still tastes good. I'm not-
So, I mean, and you can research this, and you can know what the right portion size is, and still find yourself failing, not taking the right amount in, right? And you can hide it from yourself by, well, I'm just gonna have this little bowl, but then you have another little bowl, another little bowl, another little bowl. Again, that would be a lack of self-control. What else would be along those ways? Oh, just sticking to healthy food. If unhealthy food tends to taste good, what's the big complaint about healthy food? It doesn't usually taste as good because it doesn't have as much fat or salt or sweetness or the other things that we like. The one thing that you can get away with is putting hot sauce on it. So hot sauce isn't usually bad for you. So that it doesn't add calories or anything like that. But maybe you don't like really hot things. Again, lack of self-control. The person who's self-controlled, who successfully, say, diets and sticks to what's healthy for them, they may not like it. They may not actually be temperate yet. Temperance would be actually enjoying the right portion size, feeling good about that, rather than feeling deprived, but still following. Some other examples. He says there's incontinence in relation to things that are instrumentally good, like wealth. And this could work a couple different ways. Do we spend too much, more than we planned on spending at times? Yeah.
No, when I go to the grocery store hungry, I'll spend more money than I should.
Yeah, they've done research on this, and the outcome is you're not supposed to go to the grocery store hungry, right? Because everything looks much better then, and you're more likely to engage in the impulse buying, that the stuff that's on special.
Probably going though, because there's nothing in your fridge, you know what I mean?
Well, you could choose not to wait that long. I think these are very mundane matters, but you notice that virtue ethics does tie into ordinary lives.
I feel like grocery shopping is health and wealth. I feel like it's a huge,
Oh, sure.
stage of like how good you are with your health and your wealth.
For instance, do you buy all pre-made processed foods, which are probably not very good for you in general, or do you buy things and make them from scratch? If you make them from scratch, you know what goes into it because you're putting it in, right? It's much healthier to do, but it takes some discipline, doesn't it? You can make mac and cheese just as good as Kraft mac and cheese. You can make it even better, but it takes some work. Yesterday I spent probably a good fourth of my work day making food. I baked bread, and I made soup from scratch. That's about it. That's all I did. Baking bread takes a while.
Yeah.
There's different things to it. Making soup, you got to brown the things and then put them in the pan, and then figure out what spices you want going into it. You got to make sure if you're using dried beans to actually have them set out the night before in water so they're reconstituted. But if you do it, it's healthier for you. And I suppose if we wanted to think of like temperance with respect to food in terms of food preparation, if you really liked, if you got yourself to the point where you liked that, then you would have the virtue. Otherwise, you're exercising self-control. Now, if I give in and I say, don't have time to do this sort of stuff, I don't make the time, I'm just going to buy Kraft mac and cheese. That would be an example of lack of self-control. If I actually know that it's not good for me. I mean, some people don't yet know that this stuff is not that good for them. What else was it about? So we can spend things. Do any of you ever buy more when it comes to like giving gifts than you'd intended to? No. Some people could be at the other end of being stingy, yeah.
Like sometimes you'll buy a gift for someone like early in, like I guess before Christmas, like it's Black Friday, and then it gets closer to Christmas and that person really wants something and you really want to kind of, I guess, make their Christmas or whatever.
So you get them a different, additional gift.
Yeah.
Yeah. There could be all sorts of things having to do with money. Did any of you ever make budgets? You probably want to get in that habit before you start actually making a lot of money, because otherwise the money just like disappears. It's amazing how quickly you can spend it. You know, making a budget, that's a matter of self-control. Is it fun to deprive yourself and say, no, I'm not going to go to the movies this week? No, I only budgeted this amount for this. I can't do this month. That's not fun, at first at least. After a while, it can actually become fun, and that would fall under, believe it or not, that would fall under that virtue of generosity that Aristotle talks about, how you manage your giving and your taking, your spending and intake of wealth. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I was gonna say that sometimes at the beginning when you start like saving money, it's like it's kind of painful. But if you save for a good reason, then at the end when you start spending that money for the reason you've been saving it for, then it's worth it, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, I mean, it could go the other way too. There are some people, we've talked about this before, who have the vice of stinginess. They only want to take. They don't want to spend anything. Could you have something like that over here? Well, let's say you have kids, and you know that you should buy your kids new school clothes because it's a new school year and their clothes don't fit that well, and you don't want them to be the only kids that don't have new clothes going to school. You know what the right thing to do is, but you find yourself having this desire to hold on to the money, to not do it. So you don't take them out shopping. You don't buy them new clothes. That could be a lack of self-control. You feel like you want to, but you still can't bring yourself to do it. Then, what would be self-control? Making yourself actually spend that money that it's like pulling it out of your hand, right? So it could be on either side. It could be having to do with spending too much. It could be with having to spend too little, the right things, the wrong things. What else? What about procrastination? Do you think that would fit into this at all? Did any of you procrastinate? I do.
All of us probably, yeah.
What's going on with procrastination? What does it feel like? Feels good. Well,
At some point,
it's not entirely, right?
Sometimes it does.
Yeah.
Until you get to where you need to finish the assignments.
Yeah. I mean, when you procrastinate, you realize at a certain point, oh, this stuff has to get done, right? So again, there's some sort of principle being involved, but you find yourself sometimes unable to actually follow through and make yourself get that thing done. Work. That's usually what we procrastinate about. What else do we procrastinate about? Telling people bad news, exercise programs. Anything else we tend to procrastinate about? You can think of offhand? Oh, writing letters. You get yourself into that cycle where, or an email or something to somebody, You used to correspond with them, and you let it go too long because you keep putting it off, and you know you shouldn't. And then after a while you feel guilty about it, so now you don't want to think about it, and it takes longer, and now you're still not writing them letters, and the cycle just keeps on repeating itself, and now you feel really guilty, and you feel like if you're going to write them a letter, it should be a really long letter to make up for all the time that has passed. So it should, you really need the time to make it into a good letter, to devote to it, to make it the kind of product that it ought to be. And then does it ever happen? No, but you feel guilty about it. You continue to feel guilty about it, right? That would be a lack of self-control with respect to something that Aristotle doesn't really talk about. What about making lots of plans? Do people sometimes get stuck in the cycle of making tons of plans, and that actually sucks up so much of their time they don't get anything done? Have you ever seen anyone do this? It can become its own sort of, almost a vice. Pretty minor one, but it can become a habit. People can tell themselves, I'm doing the right thing. I mean, look at how organized this is. People, now with the computers, you can put everything into a table, color-coded, hour by hour, but then they don't do it. Well, again, that would be lack of self-control.
Now that you actually mentioned that, I remember my freshman year, I used to study with one of my friends for like the bio classes.
Yeah.
And then sometimes he used to make so many like notes and stuff, and just have them like organized. And then she would pull like an all-nighter, just doing like organizing notes and stuff. And then 2 hours before the test, she was like, I should have studied for my test. I was like, yeah.
Yeah. I suppose you could spend a lot of time creating study guides, and then that actually is the study guide.
Hopefully you learned while you were making it, I guess.
Hopefully, yeah. What are some other things? Aristotle talks about victory, the desire to actually win, to come out on top. Does that sometimes bring out the worst in us? Sure. Yeah. I mean, some people want to be right all the time. We can have a lack of self-control with respect to that. Being honored, being looked up to, very closely related, I think, isn't it? He also talks about family, parents, children. We can think about with this respect to friends. Are there cases where we end up doing the wrong thing or not doing the right thing because we're too concerned with our family or our friends? And we know that we ought to be doing the right thing, but we find ourselves not doing it because we've got to pay attention to the kids or got to spend time with the parents. That happens, doesn't it? I mean, people can often turn their domestic situation into the whole world. That wouldn't actually be virtue. That would probably be a type of incontinence. And then what's the other big one you talked about? Anger. And this is one that's worth thinking about. There's people who have a vicious disposition with respect to anger. They actually think that they're doing the right thing when they retaliate in the way that they do, when they hold on to grudges, when they get as angry as they do about the things that they do. Think about people who get angry over really trivial things, where you're like, hey, that is not worth that reaction. That's out of proportion. Somebody. What would be an example of this? Something from your ordinary life where people get upset. Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Think about people who are upset the next day because their team lost, and they're like, you talk to them and they're shouting at you. What's with you? I didn't do anything to you. Well, pick whoever you like. The Bears, the Jets, whoever, lost. They were robbed. The refs were bad calls. And they're like still fuming about it. Well, if they think that that's okay, they're vicious. some people will, tell themselves that sort of thing is okay long enough till they actually believe that. They may find themselves losing self-control, but then seeing that that was the wrong thing to do. Anger is a tough one to resist, isn't it? It's kind of funny if you think about sports teams. People shout at the TV, don't they? Shout at other people. Sometimes people throw things. They get upset and they throw things around. What else do people do over anger over sports?
That's how one of my professors got a black eye. He decided to be a Cowboys fan, threw his remote at the floor, bounced right back, hit him in the eye.
Well, that'll teach him. Oh, sometimes people vandalize things,
And I sold it.
Um,
And I sold it.
What else do they do? Sports fans, yeah.
It was actually like a bet that like Jimmy Kimmel actually going to do during the Super Bowl, like when there's like that very intense moment where somebody touches the ball, somebody who's watching the TV, just turns the TV off and just goes to someone else.
Yeah,
Videos all over YouTube.
I can see that provoking anger.
What happened?
I didn't know about this, but apparently during the Super Bowl there's like a dare or
There's
something.
something there that Jimmy Kimmel, that people do, like when there's like an intense moment, people either shut off the TV or disconnect the TV right before
You
it
don't do
happens.
that.
Film the reactions.
Yeah,
He
film
does
the-
have little kids too.
Wow. Yeah. Well, yeah, anger is something that easily gets away with us.
Right before a big play,
Again, if we think about this sort of cycle, there's losing control because of anger. There's reining in your anger, even though you don't feel like it, but because you recognize it's the right thing to do. And then there's the virtuous state where the person gets angry at the right time, to the right amount, to the degree that they should, with the right people, which is probably going to be not getting very angry, isn't it? And forgiving fairly easily. Yeah.
Just like another example of that, I felt like I had to bring it up. Just like there's videos on YouTube of people, like hidden cameras of people when they find out that like their girlfriend or their mom has like canceled their World of Warcraft. Like these kids just go
Those
crazy.
people are addicted to play
Wow.
that game.
They go crazy.
Interesting.
Yeah.
It's like an
Yeah,
alternate
it's
reality.
really-
There's probably a whole genre of videos like that.
It's pretty funny.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out
Not
because,
eliminate.
as interested as I am in anger responses, these sound like exactly the sort of thing I should be taking a look at. Let's think of a few other examples. Sexual pleasure, that's one that often gets us in a lot of trouble. Do people do things that they recognize at the time aren't the right thing to do, but they feel themselves sort of overcome by passion? Express it however you want. Passion, lust, desire, attraction, Do they end up doing the wrong thing? I mean, it's not the same thing as somebody who actually thinks that what they're doing is A-okay and everyone else should be doing it. And if they're not, they're a bunch of dummies. Somebody who says, yeah, this is not the right thing, but I found myself unable to resist. What are some of the examples of that with sexual desire? What about cheating? Breaking up some sort of relationship. What else? What else would fit under there, do you think? Yeah.
I don't know, probably sleeping with somebody you've only known for like a couple hours.
Yeah, risky behavior. I mean, think of all the different things that could go wrong. If you don't know somebody very well and you're sleeping with them, first off, they could be nuts. You might wake up next to them and, who knows? They've got a clown face on or a knife or whatever. They're in your credit cards.
Or they don't look anything like you thought they looked the night
Well,
before.
that's another hazard. that one goes along with dimly lit places and drinking, doesn't it? Yeah.
Also, it goes along with that, but just with anybody, maybe sleeping like unprotected sex, sometimes. Like,
Yeah.
they can do some
If you're
rushing
going,
into it.
yeah, I mean, if you're going to actually, say, sleep around indiscriminately, what would prudence actually tell you? You probably should, wear some sort of protection. Make sure that somebody's using some sort of protection. all right? Given the sort of things that are out there, doesn't that seem the rational thing to do? But people get overcome by desire, don't they? Very easy to do. I mean, just think back to the beginnings of puberty, which is not that long ago for you guys. Even for me, it's, you know, I remember it. Think back to what it was like to have these hormones just coursing through your system. You know, and find yourself unable to tear your eyes away from you know, people of whatever you were attracted to, whatever type it is that got you going. It's hard to resist that, isn't it? It's hard to resist the lure of pleasure. There's one other thing I want to hit on as well. Aristotle talks about several different ways in which our reasoning can get screwed up, and when it comes to lack of self-control. One of these he calls impetuosity, or you could think about it as just jumping into things too quickly. In this case, the person, whatever it is that's attracting them or you know, pressing on them, it gets there first, you might say. And they don't actually start thinking about it, they just start acting on it. Anger often works like that, doesn't it? But so can sexual desire, so can the wish to beat everybody else in some sort of competitive situation. That's, he thinks, in certain respects, less of a problem than when a person actually has thought about it. And they say, this is the wrong thing to do, but I'm going to do it anyway. Right? Which may be more like the eating thing. You know? Although eating could work both ways. You're sitting at the restaurant, everybody's having a good time, you're not really paying attention to things, somebody puts something in front of you, you don't realize that it's too big, too rich, too you know, add all these other things in, that there's dessert's going to be following, you know, pick whatever you want. That could be impetuosity. In many cases, it's a lack of follow-through, though. What he calls, you know, not being able to stand up to things. There is another thing, too, that he mentions that I want to bring up. Is every time that we exercise self-control, where we say, I'm going to do what I choose to do, is that always going to be a good thing? Can that go wrong? What do you think? What about when somebody is stubborn or obstinate? He talks about that, doesn't he? He says that that's not really self-control. The stubborn person is able to resist things that are tempting them, but they also resist a lot of things that they probably shouldn't resist. So he says, where is this? He says there's some persons who stand by their opinion who we call obstinate, meaning they're hard to convince and not easily persuaded to change their convictions. They bear some resemblance to the self-restrained person. But they're really different in many respects. The self-restrained person stands firm against what? What are they actually opposing? Passion, desire, pleasures, things that attract us, things that would tempt us to do the wrong thing. What does the obstinate person stand up against? They might stand up against those. But you know what else they typically stand up against? Other people telling them that this is the right thing to do. And they're not going to do it. Because it's not the right thing to do. They didn't choose it. Well, then what they're doing is they're standing up against reason. See, the self-controlled person, one sec, the self-controlled person is actually following reason against their desires. The obstinate person is following something else against reason. So what do you think they're actually following? Desires. What kind of desires?
To be right.
To be right, yeah. That same wish for victory, like he says, they're often led by pleasure. And he distinguishes between the opinionated, the stupid, and the boorish. He says the motives of the opinionated are pleasure and pain. The agreeable sense of victory and not being persuaded to change their minds. Some people really like not to have their minds changed. They want to stick to what they believe, whether it's reasonable or not. There's some people who just won't change their minds, like he says, because they're stupid. They fail to recognize what reason actually says. They're less poorly off than people who are opinionated. What were you going to say?
I had a question about, because we're, it's kind of confused. It's about pleasure, not like opinions, right?
Oh, that's fine.
Because what about those people that their opinions are not based in like their thoughts, they're kind of based in their faith, which is a man-created idea. But
Yeah.
if you have a religion that believes in something and you're so stubborn and you're not going to be open.
You're not going to consider what reason would dictate.
Yeah. Like if somebody has an idea that
Okay.
is about the soul,
Yeah,
you're not going to change.
Aristotle, I mean, he's writing a very different cultural milieu.
Sorry.
And so he doesn't consider this, but there's no reason why he couldn't. If you look at the great religious traditions, you can find, in any religious tradition, you can find some people who are opinionated and they've got their, I learned this back in Bible school and I'm never going to budge from it sort of attitude. I can speak most about the Christian theological traditions because I've done a lot more study of that than I have with Islamic or Hindu or Buddhist traditions. And I can say this, that that sort of attitude goes against the mainstream of Christian thought. If you look at, say, the Sermon on the Mount, right? Central to Christian ethics. You got this Jesus guy telling the crowd, blessed are these people, this is what you ought to do. He's saying things like, if you're angry with your brother, you have to make up with him. He's not saying anything like, pick what you want to believe and just stick to that and don't listen to anybody. You're not going to find that in the Sermon on the Mount, right? And you're not going to find that in a lot of the other scriptural passages, and you're not going to find that in the broad stream of Christian thought. You're not going to find St. Thomas Aquinas saying that, or St. Anselm saying that, or even the people who were very close in time to the early Christian community saying things like that. They'll say things like, well, if this is any good, we ought to be able to provide some justification for it. We ought to be able to explain ourselves. And so the mainstream of the intellectual tradition within Christianity has always resisted that sort of thing. You can still find a lot of people who are going to say, no, I learned this, and that's all there is to it. And oftentimes those are hard people to teach even in a Bible class, right? Now, I think you could say the same thing for any other religious tradition as well. And it's interesting that you bring that up, too, because these categories get used within Christian ethics and Jewish ethics and other things to make sense of the things. The notion of vice as being something that a person has rooted in their soul, a bad disposition, and wanting to move away from it towards virtue. It's not just people like Aristotle talked about virtue, it's also people like, say, St. Augustine or Brutality. And they thought that you had to proceed through this. You had to exercise your will. So the stubborn person would be, in a way, sort of short-circuiting their spiritual development. We're getting pretty far beyond Aristotle with this, but it's a good question. Maybe something that makes us a bit more relevant. So that's where we'll end. So what about brutality? With that condition, something has happened to the person, and that's different than just plain old vice, where we can hold the person more or less responsible. Aristotle says that brutality is, in some ways, not as bad as vice. It's not as reprehensible as vice, but in other ways, it's more horrible. Why would that be? Well, there's something that's become damaged in the brutalized person, or in the brutal person, the person who literally has become more animalistic. The word that we translate as brutality there means someone who's like an animal. So think of it like this. You know, you have this human soul, and you have this rational part, and that's part of what separates you from the other animals. Dogs are nice, right? A lot of you have dogs as pets, but dogs are just animals. They have their own nature. They are not rational beings. They do communicate with each other, but they don't communicate like this. Like we said before, a dog doesn't ask itself the question, am I a good dog? Have I got good habits? Am I exercising self-control when I need to? A dog doesn't take control over itself that way. A dog doesn't worry about fairness or impose, fairness on other people or itself, does it? Well, what can land us in conditions like this? Aristotle talks about a number of different cases. He says the vicious person, the highest part of their being, the rational part of their being, which ought to pervade all of all the dimensions of your being, it's either not there at all, or it got damaged in some way, or it's out of commission, you might say, or it didn't develop as it should, it only partly developed. The vicious person has managed to corrupt something important in themselves. They've managed to corrupt that rational part, so it gives them the wrong answers. The brutal person didn't even get that far. You can think of it that way. The vicious person can't see what the right and genuinely good thing is because of their vice. And if they get rid of that vice, they would get better. And that requires changing the character a bit. The brutal person, some of them you may not be able to do anything with. They may be so damaged that they can never actually see the good as the good. They can never see what they're doing is actually bad. And so we say that the vicious person bears responsibility for their part. They can't snap their fingers and quit being vicious right away, but they are responsible. We talked about this back with book 3, didn't we? We looked at it and said, yeah, the vicious person has become vicious through their actions. With the person who's brutal, there's something wrong there that's of a different order. They don't really have a choice. They're not acting on the basis of having formed their character through choices. It could be that something else has formed it for them, you might say. So they don't bear responsibility. What would be some instances of this? Well, think about what would be some cases, think back to book 3 when we talked about this. What would be some cases where you yourself personally would not hold another person responsible for their clearly bad behavior? Not just one act, but a pattern of actions. When would you not hold somebody responsible? Yeah.
If they were crazy or mentally retarded.
Okay. So if there's something actually wrong with their mind, maybe there's an organic problem, right? There are some things that we can fix to some degree with pharmaceuticals, There are some people who can get stabilized a bit if you give them, some of the things we give them are pretty high power too, and they have a lot of side effects, but somebody who's manic or bipolar, they might give them lithium. That's pretty high-powered treatment for that. There's antipsychotic drugs. People who have a psychosis, they're really detached from reality. They might, go and attack people because they think that they're demons. Some people hear voices. You can give them drugs that might alter their brain chemistry. This can be more or less successful. There could be some people who are damaged because of some sort of birth defect. Maybe part of their brain doesn't develop as it should. Giving them drugs is probably not going to help in that case because it's not going to supply what's missing. But yeah, we often don't hold people responsible, or we actually think we shouldn't hold people responsible for those sort of cases. Are there any other cases where we sometimes don't hold people responsible? Did you ever end up? Yeah.
Like kids, like younger people?
Yeah. And kids can do some pretty horrific things. Although sometimes we do try them as adults, that would be holding them responsible. And we do have, sort of penal institutions for them. I had a music teacher who used to teach at a place called Wales School for Boys, and this is where they put all the murderers and rapists and the kids who were doing the really bad things, who were under 18, and they tried to stab him. Actually, a music teacher. Luckily, he actually had a fake leg. This is kind of a funny story. He had a fake leg because he'd been in a car accident, and so he had an entire fake leg. He used to tap time on it when he would do music lessons, which is a little bit creepy. The kid who tried to stab him stabbed him in his fake leg, and of course he didn't flinch or cry out or anything like that. He just grabbed the kid and until the guards came, and so then nobody messed with him ever again because they thought he was so tough that he could take the stabbing and not be affected by it. But you notice that kid stabbed him. And there were other cases too with Wales School for Boys where I remember another teacher got raped, another teacher got murdered in the home itself. And these are kids that there's something wrong with them. Do we punish them the same as adults? Not usually. And there are certain things we might not hold kids responsible for. What are other cases where we excuse people? We say they don't have control. They couldn't possibly do otherwise. Because there's something damaged about them. Anything that comes to mind? What about people who are suffering addiction? Now, I know in our society we have a lot of, this addiction and that addiction. Let's say we think about hard drugs. Somebody who's addicted to crystal meth or cocaine or heroin. Heroin's particularly bad, what it takes to get clean from it. Do we hold them responsible in the same way as we would, the junkie steals, for example. They have to feed their habit. They got to get money from somewhere, and sooner or later they run out of money. There's other people who just like stealing. That's a vicious disposition. Would you hold the junkie responsible in the same way as you would somebody who just likes to steal and does it all the time? Yeah, you can say that they have made themselves that way. And so they may have passed down through the scale. And Aristotle actually says, other things too, certain vices like cowardice, anger, if they tend to really deep excess, they tend towards this kind of morbidity or sickness. And after a certain point, it seems like Aristotle says, there's something that shifts and the person is no longer responsible for their behavior. And again, he says this is more horrific than vice, because the person seems to be less of a person, don't they?
Oh, so you're saying the drugs, the alcohol,
Well, we talk about them not being the same person as they were before. And addiction, at a certain point, does take over. What were you going to say?
I was going to say, I know a lot of the time, being alcoholic and stuff like that, it has a genetic factor, and the choice. I mean, you have some choice, but it's still, I don't know.
Yeah, there's a question about how responsible a person is. There is a gene they found that predisposes people towards excessive alcohol use.
Like you can make choices, but you can't change the fact that you have an addictive personality, I guess. you can work around it, but
Yeah.
you still have it.
And you know, there's some addictions that it seems a little bit harder to make the case, like, you know, sex addiction. Are they really totally out of control, or maybe are they vicious? You know, I think in an Aristotelian sense, probably vicious, unless maybe there's something going haywire in the brain. But somebody who's actually become addicted to heroin or crystal meth or cocaine, either powdered or crack, at a certain point they pass into this. And then they're almost lost, right? I mean, there's no way they're going to get out of there without somebody helping them. And it could be that the best that they can get to is going to be this with respect to that. That, you know, they're always going to have those desires, and they need a lot of support systems in place to keep them from succumbing to those desires. But until then, they may be over here. What about people who suffer horrific abuse? Aristotle actually talks about that. You know, it might surprise you to find that he talks about acquired habits. He talks about this in terms of, like, you know, these things that make the fabric of who we are. He says there could be acquired habits which are developed through living in a culture with very bad customs. So, you know, if you grow up in a society that thinks that killing people is A-okay, you're probably going to be pretty screwed up, aren't you? You may be so screwed up that you actually fit into this. It may be impossible to do anything with you. What about child abuse? You know, there's a lot of varieties of this. I mean, there's sexual abuse, there's neglect. Children who suffer horrific neglect, it may be quite difficult to even place them on the rest of this moral spectrum. You know, when they're unable to relate to other people. Some children have what's called attachment disorder. They're never able to bond with parents, and it turns out that's actually important for normal moral development. And what you can get out of that is somebody who first is a child and then an adult who can't relate to other people, and who may in fact be quite dangerous because of that. Aristotle would call that a brutal state. He actually talks about childhood sexual abuse. You know, children who are sexually abused, what happens to them? You know, how does that transform their moral world? I mean, think about it. What goes on is it's usually going to be somebody who's, you know, not just a random stranger. It's somebody who's involved in their life who they can't get away from, and somebody who ought to be treating them in a loving way, right? So what do they come to see? They come to see that this is the best things can be, and I am an object for this person, and that means other people later on, you know, when I'm mature, are just objects for me in the same way. One reason why abused children are at much greater risk for being abusive themselves, aren't they? Because it skews the entire moral universe, depending on how bad the abuse is. I mean, let me bring up two examples that you could think about. One's pretty recent. I may have mentioned this in class before. It's actually going to trial now. Happened in my home state of Wisconsin. Have any of you guys been following this story? About this girl who was essentially starved almost to death. Well, her stepmother and I think father and their son were eating up above, overweight, massively overweight, and cooking food and all that. They made her live in the basement with just a sink. No toilet, no anything like that. They did a lot of horrific things to her. There was sexual abuse as well. When they would let her out of the basement, it was to go out in the yard and like move cinder blocks around the yard, pointless activities like that, just to try to break her. let's say, now she's, in somewhat better hands. Is she ever going to be a completely whole person? That really depends. And Aristotle, if she were to end up doing bad things as a result, Aristotle probably would not hold her as responsible as somebody else, any one of us who developed vicious behaviors and then started doing bad things. I'll give you another example as well, which involved sexual abuse. When I first moved to Indiana, there was a famous case in Indianapolis where a couple had been pimping out their children for years in a sex ring. And their kids were from like 5 through 10 years old. And they would make the children have sex with other people and also perform sex shows with each other. And if the kids didn't do that, they would whip them with electrical cords. And so these kids were really brutalized. And that's pretty horrific abuse. That's going pretty far. So they took the kids away, thank God, and this couple went to prison, and they're going to be there the rest of their life, again, which is good. The kids were all put in a foster home, and then you try to keep kids together, when they've been in traumatic situations because they help to support each other. They had to be transferred from the foster home because they had to be split up because the only way that these kids knew how to relate to each other was by having sex with each other. So that's how they would interact with each other. That goes far beyond having sort of vicious, orientations towards sexuality and how we ought to relate to other people. There's something that was removed from those kids' lives. We often talk about abuse as destroying innocence. That's a clear case where the normal development of the child has been just robbed from them, hasn't it? So a lot of these cases of brutalization are going to be like that. Aristotle talks about a few other interesting examples, where somebody feels a compulsion that they're unable to resist, certain morbid states that they end up in. Certain diseases can do this to people as well. Certain diseases can affect your neurology, can't they? People like to put those in those doctor shows like House or what's another one where they do that. The person actually, starts behaving in erratic ways because they've got some sort of fever that's affecting their brain. Aristotle would say they're not responsible for their actions. Again, to stress this point, he says it's not as bad in one sense, but it's worse in another sense because what's distinctively human about them has been damaged to such a degree. Vice damages what's distinctively human in us. Our moral compass, we often say, our sense of right and wrong. It damages it, it corrupts it, but it doesn't destroy it. With brutality, it's effectively destroyed.